It was a night that seemed ripped straight out of a nightmare. A cold, merciless rain poured down as if the heavens themselves were weeping for what had just transpired. The park, usually bustling with life during the day, now lay eerily silent under the cover of darkness, its shadows stretching like ghostly fingers across the empty paths. My girlfriend, Sarah, stumbled through those desolate trails, her clothes torn and soaked, her face bruised and streaked with tears that mingled with the raindrops streaming down her cheeks. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale visible in the frosty air, as though even her body was trying to escape the horror she'd endured. She didn't scream when it happened, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear paralyzed her completely. He came out of nowhere, his silhouette looming large against the dim streetlights at the edge of the park. Before she could react, he grabbed her, his grip like iron around her arms, and dragged her deeper into the shadows where no one could hear her cries. She begged him to stop, pleaded with him to let her go, but he only laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. And then came the worst part. It wasn't just the physical violation, it was the way he whispered threats into her ear, promising her that if she ever told anyone, he'd come back for her. By the time he finally left her crumpled on the ground, trembling and broken, Sarah felt more than violated, she felt hunted. When she finally made it home hours later, I opened the door to find her standing there like a ghost. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, her mascara smeared beneath swollen eyes, and her lips quivering so violently that no words could form. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body shaking as though she might fall apart at any moment. I held her tightly, feeling utterly powerless as wave after wave of grief crashed over us both. Every instinct screamed at me to call the police, to make sure this monster paid for what he'd done, but Sarah wouldn't let me. No, she choked out between sobs, clutching onto me as if I were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Please, please don't. What if he comes back? What if they don't believe me? Her refusal tore at my heart. Here she was, shattered and vulnerable, and all I wanted to do was protect her, but how could I fight an enemy I couldn't see? How could I shield her from a world that might judge her instead of helping her heal? As the hours turned into days, Sarah withdrew further into herself. She stopped eating, barely slept, and spent most of her time staring blankly at the walls, lost in thoughts too dark for me to reach. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of her screaming, thrashing in bed as nightmares replayed the attack over and over again. Each cry cut through me like a knife, leaving me desperate to fix something I knew I couldn't undo. Every night felt like a battle, a relentless war against an invisible enemy that had taken hold of Sarah's mind. The days were hard enough, but the nights were pure torment. She would wake up screaming, thrashing in bed as if trying to escape some unseen force. Sometimes, she'd sit upright, her eyes wide open but unseeing, tears streaming down her face as she whispered fragments of sentences I couldn't understand. Other times, she'd cry so loudly it seemed like the walls themselves might crumble under the weight of her anguish. And then there were the nights when silence reigned, deadly, suffocating silence, and I'd find her sitting on the floor by the window, staring out into the darkness, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she were holding herself together. I tried everything to comfort her, staying awake beside her, holding her hand, even reading aloud from books she used to love. But nothing worked. No matter what I did, no matter how many hours I spent reassuring her, the pain inside her refused to fade. It was as if the attack had carved a wound so deep that no amount of care or love could heal it. Some nights, she'd lash out at me, accusing me of not understanding what she was going through. "You weren't there," she'd scream, her voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like." And she was right, I didn't. But that didn't stop me from wanting to save her, even if saving her meant sacrificing pieces of myself along the way. As the weeks dragged on, the toll this took on both of us became impossible to ignore. My job suffered because I kept taking time off to be with her. Eventually, I quit altogether. I told myself it was temporary, that once Sarah started healing, I could go back to work. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about giving her emotional support, it was also about keeping her safe. There were moments when I feared she wouldn't survive another day without someone watching over her. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I caught her staring blankly at a bottle of pills on the kitchen counter. When I asked her what she was doing, she shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter anymore." Those 5 words sent chills down my spine. That same week, disaster nearly struck. I came home late one afternoon after running errands and found her lying motionless on the bathroom floor. A half-empty bottle of sleeping pills lay next to her, its contents spilled across the tiles. Panic surged through me as I dropped to my knees beside her, shaking her gently, begging her to wake up. For a few agonizing seconds, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, her eyelids fluttered open, and she looked at me with an expression so hollow it made my chest ache. "Why did you stop me?" she murmured weakly, her voice barely audible. That moment shattered something inside me. Up until then, I'd been fighting for her recovery, hoping against hope that she'd pull through. But now, faced with the reality of how close I'd come to losing her, I realized just how fragile her life truly was. Her suicide attempt forced me to confront my own limitations. How much more could I endure before I broke too? Every ounce of strength I had left was poured into caring for her, but the pressure was relentless. Financial stress added fuel to the fire. Without my income, we struggled to pay rent and cover medical bills. My parents, who had always expected me to prioritize stability and success, grew increasingly critical. They called me selfish for abandoning my career, accused me of being too soft, for sticking by Sarah instead of moving on with my life. Their disapproval stung, especially since I already felt like I was failing her in so many ways. Yet, despite their harsh words, I couldn't walk away. Leaving Sarah alone felt like sentencing her to death, and I wasn't willing to live with that guilt. Therapy sessions became our lifeline, though they often left us emotionally drained. Sitting in those sterile rooms, listening to Sarah recount the details of her trauma, was excruciating. She spoke haltingly, her voice trembling as she described the attack, the fear, the helplessness, the violation. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my heart. I wanted to shield her from reliving it, but I knew she needed to talk about it in order to heal. Still, progress was painfully slow. Even after months of counseling, the nightmares persisted, and the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. One particularly grueling session stands out in my memory. Sarah broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as she admitted she felt unworthy of love or forgiveness. "How can anyone ever look at me the same way again?" she choked out, clutching her knees to her chest. "I'm ruined." Hearing her say those words gutted me. I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly, and promised her that I saw her, not the victim, not the survivor, but her. "You are still the most incredible person I've ever known," I told her firmly, my voice cracking with emotion. "Nothing will ever change that." But promises, no matter how heartfelt, couldn't erase the pain. The truth was, I was drowning alongside her. Nights blurred into days, and exhaustion became my constant companion. There were mornings when I woke up feeling utterly defeated, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. Yet, every time I considered giving up, I remembered the image of Sarah lying unconscious on the bathroom floor. That memory haunted me, driving me forward even when I thought I couldn't take another step. It was supposed to be a routine morning, one of those quiet, unremarkable days where we tried to pretend life could still feel normal. Sarah had been feeling off for weeks, though she chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. I encouraged her to take a pregnancy test just to rule out any possibilities. Deep down, neither of us truly believed it would come back positive. But when the small plastic stick revealed 2 pink lines, time seemed to stop. The air in the bathroom grew heavy, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around us. Sarah stared at the result, her hands trembling so violently that the test nearly slipped from her grasp. Then, without warning, her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold tile floor. "His baby? It's his baby," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the sound of her ragged breathing. "It will always remind me of that night." Her words hit me like a freight train, each syllable carrying the weight of everything we'd been trying so desperately to escape. She curled into herself, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. I knelt beside her, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to say or do. No amount of reassurance could undo the cruel twist of fate staring us in the face. The image of the unborn child, a living, breathing reminder of the attack, loomed over us like a dark cloud, casting its shadow across every thought and decision. In the days that followed, Sarah became consumed by despair. Every glance in the mirror seemed to deepen her anguish, as if her own reflection mocked her with the truth she couldn't escape. She began referring to the pregnancy not as a life but as a curse, a constant, visceral reminder of the violence inflicted upon her. For me, the emotional toll was equally devastating. Watching her spiral further into darkness made me question whether I had the strength to keep holding on. How could I support someone through something this unimaginable? And yet, abandoning her felt unthinkable. But the nightmare didn't end there. Enter her mother, the person who should have been our greatest ally but instead became our most formidable adversary. From the moment Sarah confided in her about the pregnancy, her mother launched an all-out assault on both of us. Phone calls came daily, sometimes multiple times a day, each one more venomous than the last. Her voice dripped with judgment and disdain, accusing me of manipulating Sarah into considering an abortion. "You're forcing her to kill an innocent child," she screamed during one particularly heated call. "Do you have no soul? No conscience?" Each accusation cut deeper, not because they held any truth but because they amplified the guilt and frustration already weighing on me. Her texts were no less relentless. Messages flooded Sarah's phone at all hours, each one filled with dire warnings and thinly veiled threats. If you go through with this, don't expect me to ever forgive you, read one. Another simply stated, God will punish you for this sin. As if the trauma of the attack and the burden of the pregnancy weren't enough, now Sarah faced the added pressure of losing her family's love and approval. Her mother even went so far as to cut off financial support, leaving us scrambling to cover basic expenses while I struggled to find stable work again after quitting my job to care for Sarah. The breaking point came during a video call Sarah reluctantly agreed to. Her mother sat on the other side of the screen, her expression stern and unyielding. I raised you better than this, she spat, her tone icy. How can you destroy a life created by God? Don't you understand the gravity of what you're doing? Sarah visibly flinched, her eyes filling with tears as she stammered out a response. Mom, please. I can't, she began, only to be interrupted by a sharp retort. If you abort this baby, consider yourself dead to me. You'll never see your brother or your father again, not even in heaven. Those words shattered whatever fragile resolve Sarah had left. After hanging up, she retreated to our bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I found her lying on the bed, clutching a pillow to her chest as sobs racked her body. Why is she doing this to me? She cried, her voice raw with pain. She's supposed to love me. Why does everyone hate me? I sat beside her, pulling her close despite the storm raging inside me. They don't hate you, I murmured, though I wasn't sure I fully believed it myself. They're just too blinded by their own beliefs to see how much you're suffering. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Sarah and her mother reached a fever pitch. One evening, I answered the phone to hear her mother's shrill voice demanding to speak to Sarah. When I refused, citing her fragile state, the woman exploded. You think you're helping her, she hissed. You're ruining her life. If anything happens to her, I swear to God, I'll make sure you pay. The threat hung in the air long after the call ended, leaving me shaken. Who was this woman, and why did she seem determined to tear apart the very foundation of our relationship? Despite the chaos swirling around us, Sarah and I clung to each other like lifelines. We spent hours talking late into the night, grappling with the impossible choices before us. She admitted that part of her wanted to keep the baby, not because she felt ready to be a mother, but because she feared disappointing her faith and alienating her family. What if she's right? She asked me one night, her voice trembling. What if I'm damning myself forever? I cupped her face in my hands, forcing her to look at me. You are not damned, I said firmly. And you are not alone. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Yet, even as we tried to navigate this tangled web of emotions and obligations, the reality of the situation loomed larger than ever. The pregnancy wasn't just a medical condition, it was a ticking time bomb threatening to destroy everything we'd fought so hard to preserve. Every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, felt like another step closer to the abyss. And through it all, her mother's voice echoed in the background, a haunting reminder of the stakes we faced. It was a conversation neither of us wanted to have, yet one that had been brewing beneath the surface for weeks. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions that threatened to explode at any moment. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold herself from falling apart. I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. We had danced around this topic for days, skirting the edges of what needed to be said, but now there was no avoiding it. The decision about the pregnancy loomed over us like an insurmountable mountain, and we both knew someone would have to make the first move. I can't do this without you, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. But I also can't. I can't kill it. Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, cutting through the silence like shards of glass. I turned to face her, my chest tightening as I saw the tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked broken, defeated, and yet somehow resolute, a woman caught between two impossible choices, each more devastating than the last. You don't understand, she continued, her voice rising with desperation. This baby, it's part of me. Even if it came from something horrible, it's still mine. How can I destroy something that's growing inside me? Her eyes pleaded with me, searching for some sign of understanding, but all I could feel was anger bubbling beneath the surface. Not at her, but at the situation, the cruel twist of fate that had forced us into this nightmare. And what about me? I shot back, my voice sharp enough to slice through steel. Do you think I can live with raising a child that will remind me every single day of what happened to you? Of the man who did this to you? My words echoed in the small room, harsh and unyielding. For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips quivering as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the strength. Then, suddenly, she erupted. Do you think I want this? She screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her anguish. Do you think I chose this? It's not fair. None of this is fair. She stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. You have no idea what it's like to carry this inside you, to feel it growing, knowing where it came from. Every heartbeat feels like a reminder of that night. Her fists clenched at her sides, and for a fleeting second, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I wanted to go to her, to pull her into my arms and tell her everything would be okay. But how could I when nothing about this was okay? Instead, I knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders firmly. Sarah, I said, my tone cold and deliberate, you need to choose. Either you keep this baby, and lose me, or you end this pregnancy, and we work on healing together. I won't stay if you choose him over us. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with shock and betrayal. Him, she choked out. You think this is about him? This isn't about him, it's about me. About surviving. Her voice broke on the last word, and she buried her face in her hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was her ragged breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When she finally looked up again, her eyes were hollow, devoid of the light I had come to love. So that's it, she asked softly, her voice barely audible. You're giving me an ultimatum? I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yes, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Because I won't, live like this. I love you, but I can't sacrifice myself completely for this. You need to decide what's more important, your faith or your future, with me. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like hours, each second heavier than the last. Finally, she stood up shakily, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Fine, she muttered, her voice laced with bitterness. If that's how you feel, then maybe you should leave. And with those words, she walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the wreckage of our relationship. In the days that followed, Sarah withdrew further into herself. The ultimatum hadn't brought clarity, it had only deepened the chasm between us. She stopped eating, barely touching the meals I prepared for her. Her once vibrant spirit seemed to dim with each passing hour, replaced by a haunting emptiness that made my heart ache. I watched helplessly as she wasted away before my eyes, her body frail and her mind consumed by despair. One evening, I found her sitting on the bathroom floor, staring blankly at the wall. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes lacked their usual spark. Why are you still here? She asked quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. You should go. You'll be happier without me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for the first time, I questioned whether I had made the right decision. Was I being selfish? Cruel? Or was I simply protecting myself from a life I wasn't sure I could endure? But leaving wasn't an option, not yet. Despite everything, I still loved her. Seeing her suffer was unbearable, and the thought of walking away felt like abandoning her in her darkest hour. Yet, staying was equally painful. Every day felt like a battle, a constant tug-of-war between my desire to save her and my need to protect myself. I began to wonder if I was strong enough to weather this storm, or if it would ultimately consume us both. It started with a knock on the door, a sound so ordinary, yet it carried the weight of impending doom. When I opened it to find 2 police officers standing there, my heart plummeted into my stomach. Their presence was like a cold shadow creeping over us, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. They asked if I was who they were looking for, and though I confirmed their suspicions, my mind raced with questions. What had happened? Who had called them? And why were they here now, at this moment when we were finally starting to rebuild our lives? My girlfriend appeared moments later, her face pale and eyes wide with confusion and fear. The officers split us up, one took her to the living room while the other led me into my bedroom. As the officer began questioning me, his tone grew increasingly accusatory. He wanted to know how long she'd been staying with me, whether she'd contacted anyone else, or if she'd left the house recently. Each question felt like another layer of suspicion being piled onto me, suffocating me under its weight. I answered as calmly as I could, but inside, anger and frustration bubbled dangerously close to the surface. When I finally pressed him for answers, he revealed that someone had reported concerns about my girlfriend's safety, someone claiming she might be in danger because of me. My stomach churned as realization dawned. Her mother. Of course, it was her. The same woman who had already tried to manipulate and control every aspect of her daughter's life was now using the law to tear us apart. The accusation hit me like a sledgehammer, leaving me reeling with disbelief and fury. How dare she accuse me of something so vile? How dare she weaponize the system against us when all I'd ever done was stand by Sarah? The interrogation ended eventually, but the damage was done. As soon as the officers left, Sarah broke down completely. She told me everything, the way they'd questioned her about whether she felt safe with me, whether I'd hurt her, whether she was being held against her will. Every word they spoke had shaken her to her core, dredging up old fears and insecurities she thought she'd buried. But worse than that was the betrayal. Her own mother had sent them here, accusing me of abuse and trying to paint me as some kind of monster. It was a calculated move, designed not only to undermine my relationship with Sarah but also to destroy whatever trust remained between them. That night, rage consumed me. I couldn't believe the audacity of her mother, accusing me of something so heinous without a shred of evidence, dragging our private struggles into the public eye. I wanted to fight back, to press charges for harassment or defamation, anything to hold her accountable for what she'd done. But Sarah begged me not to, pleading that it would only escalate things further. "She'll calm down," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Just give her time." Time? How much more of this were we supposed to endure? But the worst was yet to come. Within days, the story exploded online. Someone, undoubtedly her mother, had leaked details of our situation to social media, spinning it into a narrative that painted me as an abusive partner forcing Sarah to abort her baby. The comments poured in like venomous arrows, each one aimed straight at my heart. Strangers attacked me relentlessly, calling me a monster, a manipulator, a destroyer of families. Messages flooded my phone, some threatening violence, others filled with hate-filled rhetoric. Even my workplace wasn't spared. Screenshots of the posts made their way to my boss, who summoned me for an emergency meeting. Sitting across from him, I felt the walls closing in around me. He didn't outright accuse me of wrongdoing, but the implication hung heavy in the air. "This is serious," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "If these allegations gain traction, it could harm the company's reputation." Translation: if I didn't resolve this quickly, I'd lose my job. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized just how precarious my position had become. Everything I'd worked for, my career, my livelihood, was hanging by a thread, all because of lies spread by someone who claimed to care about Sarah. Desperate to protect myself, I hired a lawyer. It was an expense I couldn't afford, but I had no choice. Together, we drafted a statement refuting the accusations and prepared to take legal action if necessary. Meanwhile, Sarah and I agreed that any future calls from her mother would either go unanswered or be handled by me. We couldn't risk letting her manipulate Sarah again, especially not now when she was finally beginning to heal. One evening, the phone rang. Out of habit, Sarah picked it up before realizing her mistake. Her face went white, panic flashing in her eyes as she handed the device to me without saying a word. On the other end, her mother launched into a tirade, demanding to know if the abortion had taken place. When I confirmed it had, she unleashed a torrent of curses, her voice dripping with venom. I let her rant for a full minute, allowing her anger to burn itself out, before calmly responding, "How very Christian of you," and hanging up. The silence that followed was deafening, but it felt like a small victory. For the first time, we weren't cowering under her wrath, we were standing firm. Sarah looked at me with gratitude, relief washing over her features. Though we knew her mother wouldn't stop easily, we also knew we'd drawn a line in the sand. This wasn't just about protecting ourselves anymore, it was about reclaiming our power and refusing to let anyone dictate the course of our lives. The day of the procedure arrived, heavy with anticipation and dread. It was as if the air itself carried the weight of everything we had endured, the trauma, the arguments, the betrayal, and the countless sleepless nights spent grappling with impossible decisions. Sarah clung to my hand as we walked into the clinic, her fingers trembling against mine. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and I could see the storm raging behind her eyes, fear, guilt, and a desperate hope that this would finally bring her some measure of peace. As we sat in the waiting room, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. What if God won't forgive me? What if I'm damning myself forever?" Her words tore at my heart, but I forced myself to remain calm for her sake. Leaning closer, I squeezed her hand tightly and met her gaze. "If God exists," I said firmly, choosing each word with care, "then He will understand that you deserve to be free from this pain. You're not doing something wrong, you're giving yourself a chance to live again." Her lips quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But then she nodded, taking a deep, shaky breath. The nurse called her name shortly after, and we stood together, walking side by side toward the door that would lead her to the operating room. As they wheeled her away, I felt a pang of helplessness wash over me. For all my promises to stand by her, there was nothing I could do now except wait and pray that this would mark the beginning of her healing. When she emerged hours later, her face was drawn but calm. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months, one of quiet relief. We drove home in silence, the world outside blurred by rain-streaked windows. Once inside, she went straight to the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her as she cried. "It's gone," she whispered between sobs. "For the first time in months, I feel lighter. Like I can breathe again." But beneath the relief lingered a shadow of uncertainty. Pulling away slightly, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "But what happens next?" she asked softly. "Do I have the strength to keep going? To face everything that's coming?" Her question hung in the air, raw and honest, and I didn't have an easy answer. Instead, I held her tighter, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We'll figure it out together," I promised. "One step at a time." In the days that followed, Sarah seemed different, not entirely healed, but changed in subtle ways. She began sleeping through the night again, no longer waking up screaming or crying. She ate small meals, even though her appetite was still fragile. Most importantly, she started talking about the future, not just surviving, but living. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching the rain patter against the window, she turned to me with a hesitant smile. "Let's leave this place," she said suddenly, her voice tinged with determination. "Let's go somewhere where no one knows us. Somewhere peaceful." The idea took root instantly. Leaving the city behind wasn't just about escaping memories, it was about creating space for new beginnings. Over the next few weeks, we made plans, packing our belongings and tying up loose ends. It wasn't easy, neither of us had much money, and finding a new place to start over required sacrifices. But every obstacle only strengthened our resolve. Together, we envisioned a life free from judgment, free from fear, a life where we could heal without looking over our shoulders. Just as we were preparing to leave, one final blow came crashing down. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Sarah in her mother's unmistakable handwriting. My stomach churned as I handed it to her, bracing myself for whatever venom it might contain. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, scrawled with words that cut deeper than any knife. "If you've gone through with this sin, know that I will never forgive you. You are dead to me." Sarah stared at the page, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she simply sat there, the letter trembling in her hands. Then, without a word, she walked to the kitchen, lit a match, and set the paper ablaze. Watching the flames consume the hateful words, she spoke quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "She chose her faith over me," she said, her tone resolute. "So I choose happiness over acceptance." That moment marked a turning point, not just for her, but for us as a couple. In burning that letter, she symbolically severed the ties that had bound her to guilt and shame. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to let anyone else dictate the course of her life. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, we faced it with renewed determination. Our last act before leaving the city was to pack up the tent and head out for one final camping trip. The weather forecast predicted rain, but neither of us cared. As we huddled together under the canvas, listening to the rhythmic patter of raindrops, Sarah opened up about her fears and hopes. "There will still be hard days," she admitted, her voice soft but unwavering. "But I think I'm stronger now. Stronger than I ever realized." Her words filled me with a sense of awe and gratitude. Despite everything she had endured, the attack, the pregnancy, the betrayal by her own mother, she had emerged resilient, determined to reclaim her life. In that tiny tent, surrounded by nature's chaos, we found solace. Holding her close, I whispered, "We'll get through this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I truly believed it. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of everything we had endured began to settle into a new rhythm, a fragile but hopeful cadence that hinted at the possibility of healing. Sarah and I had weathered storms that would have shattered lesser bonds: the attack, the pregnancy, the ultimatums, the betrayal by her mother, and even the legal threats that loomed over us like dark clouds. Each trial had left its mark, carving scars into our hearts and testing the limits of our resilience. Yet, through it all, we clung to each other with a desperation that bordered on defiance. We were battered, bruised, but not broken, not yet. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows of our small apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand and a blank journal before me. It wasn't something I did often, writing, but tonight, the words demanded to be released. They spilled onto the page in a torrent, raw and unfiltered, capturing the essence of everything we had lost and everything we still hoped to reclaim. "We've lost so much," I wrote, my handwriting shaky with emotion. "Our families, our faith, even the simplest dreams we once took for granted. But we're alive. And as long as we're breathing, we'll fight. Not just to survive, but to live, to truly live." Tears blurred my vision as I scribbled the final sentence, and I wiped them away angrily, refusing to let myself crumble. When I finished, I closed the journal and placed it on the counter, feeling an odd sense of closure wash over me. It wasn't perfect, it couldn't undo the pain or erase the scars, but it was honest. For the first time in months, I felt like I could see a path forward, however uncertain it might be. Sarah found me sitting there, staring at the journal, and she tilted her head curiously. "What's that?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. I handed it to her without a word, watching as she opened it and began to read. Her lips moved silently as her eyes scanned the lines, and when she reached the end, she looked up at me, tears shimmering in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but the way she wrapped her arms around me spoke volumes. In that embrace, I felt the weight of our shared journey, the grief, the anger, the love, and the hope, all intertwined in a single, fragile moment. Later that night, after the rain had slowed to a drizzle, we decided to step outside. The air smelled fresh and earthy, cleansed by the storm, and the world seemed quieter, softer somehow. Hand in hand, we walked toward the park where everything had begun, the place that haunted Sarah's memories but also marked the beginning of our fight to reclaim her life. As we stood beneath the dripping trees, Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was the letter her mother had sent, the one filled with venomous accusations and ultimatums. Without hesitation, she struck a match and watched as the flames consumed the hateful words, reducing them to ash. "Mom chose her faith over me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "So I choose happiness over acceptance." The declaration hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a surge of pride swell within me. This was her moment of liberation, a quiet rebellion against the forces that had sought to define her. She turned to me then, her eyes blazing with determination, and smiled through her tears. "Let's go home," she whispered. But before we left, the rain picked up again, drenching us within seconds. Instead of running for cover, we stayed right where we were, laughing and crying in equal measure. The water soaked through our clothes, plastering our hair to our faces, but none of it mattered. In that moment, standing together under the pouring rain, we felt alive in a way neither of us had in months. It was as if the rain itself was washing away the remnants of our past, cleansing us of the pain and guilt that had weighed us down for so long. And so, the story ended, not with grand declarations or sweeping resolutions, but with two people holding hands, their laughter mingling with their tears, as they stepped tentatively into a future that promised both hope and hardship. We knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, old wounds don't heal overnight, and shadows linger even in the brightest light. But for the first time, we faced those challenges not with fear, but with courage. Together, we vowed to keep moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. Advice with humanitarian meaning: listen and empathize with those who are suffering instead of judging. Respect personal choices and support them through difficulties with love. A compassionate, forgiving community helps everyone heal and build a brighter future.